Okay, so, like, imagine this, right? You're literally in the Oval Office, but you're also running for re-election. Talk about pressure.
Yeah.
Could you imagine?
No.
So then you have to make a decision, but, like, is that President you making the call or candidate you?
It's a good question.
Today, we're diving into this legal document, and it's really trying to figure that out.
Yeah.
Like, did a former president's actions cross a line, from unofficial to official? And if so, what does that even mean for this case?
I mean, this is a whole fascinating area of law, this question. It's like,
Yeah.
how do you untangle those two things? Because they're so intertwined.
Exactly. And we're talking about everything. We're talking campaign interactions, White House staff, public statements that were made, even stuff on social media. It's a lot.
Yeah.
So buckle up, everybody.
It's a good one. It really highlights how much the digital age has changed, how we even think about this stuff. Like, what are presidential actions?
Right. Because, like, we all scroll through Twitter, right? But when it's the president, it's different.
Totally different ballgame. And this document really goes into this whole two hats problem.
Okay.
And they talk a lot about the Hatch Act, which is kind of like, if you want to think about it, it's like the rule book for what White House staffers can and can't do when it comes to politics.
Okay, so break it down for us. So if you work at the White House, can you, like, support a candidate while you're on the job?
So in a nutshell, they can be politically active, but they can't use their position to influence an election.
Got it.
So it's all about keeping those things separate. And to understand just how tricky that is, like, what does that actually mean? The document brings up this court case in Lindsay that dealt with this idea that White House staff could act as a go-between for the president for personal things.
Interesting. So even if you work at the White House, if you're doing something for the president as a person, not as the president, that's not necessarily, like, protected communication.
Right, because the court decided that just because an aide helps the president talk to a personal advisor, it doesn't mean that's official government business.
Interesting.
It's separate.
Okay. So how does that relate to this case and what we're looking at with this former president?
Well, this document argues that just like presidents can act as private citizens, so can the people around them.
Okay, so just because you work in the White House, it doesn't mean everything you do with the president is, like, official business.
Right. Which leads us to someone we encounter in this document, P9. P9 seem to be this kind of, like, bridge between the former president and the campaign, what they call a conduit.
Interesting. So what kind of things were they sharing?
So there's mention of this phone call where the former president supposedly discussed putting someone in charge of the campaign's legal strategy. And their payment depended on whether they won.
Oh, wow.
And P9 was reportedly on this call, even vouched for this person.
Wow. So they're pretty involved.
It makes you think, like, how many of these conversations happened?
Right.
The document also highlights how P9 would update the former president on the strength of, like, his fraud claims, like how good his advisors were, even his chances of winning.
So not really policy talks.
Not even close.
Got it. Okay.
Just straight campaign talk.
Now, the argument is, even though P9 worked at the White House, these conversations were all about the campaign, not the presidency.
Yeah, exactly. And on top of that, the document even points out that P9 was involved with the campaign before the election.
Yeah.
Like, there's even a request for, like, tutorials on how campaigns work.
Wow. Dedicated. Maybe a little too dedicated.
Right. And then there's P45, who had access to the former president's Twitter account. This is where I think, like, that whole two hats thing gets even more complicated in the world of social media.
Oh, totally. Because how do you even tell what's a personal thought versus, like, an official statement when it comes to a president's Twitter? And especially this president, because, he was known for speaking his mind, should I say tweeting his mind.
Tweeting his mind.
Yeah. And the document points out that P45 was basically the only other person who could post from that account.
So if they posted something, it's because the former president was like, post this.
Yeah.
Okay, got it.
But here's where it gets really interesting. The document mentions that P45 might have to testify about specific tweets that weren't sent.
Wait, so it's not just about what was tweeted, but also what wasn't tweeted?
Exactly.
Oh.
Because it could show the former president's intentions.
Oh. What he was thinking at the time. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've got P9, we've got P45, and then we also have this other layer of, like, things that weren't meant to be overheard, right? Like, there's mention of this comment that the former president supposedly made to his family after the election about fighting to stay in power no matter what, right? And P15, this other person who worked in the White House supposedly overheard that. And it wasn't about official business. It was all about the former president's, like, need to hold on to power.
And you have to remember, this was right after a very tense election. He was already challenging the results, so talk about a blurry line between his personal feelings and his official actions.
Totally. And that seems to be at the core of what this document is trying to say, is that even actions that seem unofficial can have big official consequences. Consequences we're still seeing today.
Wow.
Yeah, and it's not just about the people around him either.
Oh, really?
The document also talks about public statements made by some pretty important people, like we're talking the former president's attorney general,
Okay.
and even the head of CISA.
So for people who don't know what that is.
That's the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency.
Okay, got it.
And here's the thing. Their statements seem to completely contradict what the former president was saying about election fraud.
Oh, wow. So they're like publicly going against him?
Yeah, you could say that, for example, the document says that the attorney general flat out said that the Justice Department didn't find any evidence of fraud. That would have changed the election results.
Wow. And that's a pretty big statement considering how much the former president was pushing that narrative.
Huge. And if the document is right, the attorney general actually said that without even giving the former president a heads up.
You went rogue.
Seems like the document kind of makes it sound like he was getting more and more frustrated with the former president's claims because he knew they weren't true. So he felt like he had to say something.
It's like a little behind-the-scenes peek into how crazy things were back then.
Totally. And then there's the CISA director. The document says he supported this report from election security experts, and it basically said that the election infrastructure was totally secure.
Again, like totally going against what the former president was saying.
Exactly. And guess what? He did it on his own, too.
So you have these two major players, the attorney general and the CISA director, both contradicting the president publicly on something this important, and they're both acting independently.
It makes you wonder what was going on behind the scenes, right?
Right, like how was this administration even functioning?
Good question. Because it does seem like there was a huge disconnect between what the president was saying and what his own people were actually finding.
And the CISA director ended up getting fired because of it.
At least that's what the document says.
Right. But what I find interesting is how much the document focuses on how the former president was using social media and watching the news, especially on January 6th.
Yeah, it's a big deal. Because they claim there's forensic evidence that shows he was on Twitter all day.
Yeah.
Even while everything was going down at the Capitol.
So he's seeing everything in real time.
Yep. And it wasn't just Twitter.
Oh, right. There's also the news coverage.
Exactly. The document mentions witnesses who said he was glued to the TV, watching the news coverage of the events as they were happening.
And this is where something as everyday as watching TV or scrolling through Twitter becomes really important.
Right, because it shows us what he was thinking, how he was reacting to what was unfolding. He wasn't just some passive observer. He was actively following along.
And that awareness, that he knew what was happening in that moment, it makes you think about how that plays into the legal arguments around his actions, like his tweets that day.
Totally. It's all about context. And this document is trying to build this case that he knew exactly what he was doing, he was informed, he was engaged, and he acted with full knowledge of what was going on.
So it's not just about what those tweets said, but also when and why he sent them.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And then there's the final piece of this whole thing.
Yeah.
What he said after he was out of office.
Oh, right.
The document highlights how he kept saying that the election was stolen. And he even praised the people who stormed the Capitol.
And even though he said those things later on, the argument is that they're still relevant to understanding what his intentions were on January 6th.
Exactly. They're using those statements to try to prove what was going on in his head back then.
So it's like they're all these little pieces of a puzzle.
Right.
And they all fit together to tell a bigger story.
It really is like a puzzle. And someone has to put all those pieces together, right?
Right.
And in this case, it's up to the courts to decide how it all fits. Like, were these official acts or not?
Yeah.
And does he have immunity?
Yeah, it's a big deal because we're not just talking about one case here, right? We're talking about like the presidency. What are the limits and how do we even measure something like justice when it comes to this digital age?
Absolutely. And, you know, this document makes a really strong argument that if we let all of these like unofficial actions slide, it could create a dangerous precedent for future presidents.
Right, because if a president can just say, oh, well, everything I do while I'm president is protected, even if they're really acting in their own best interest, that's a problem.
Oh, right.
Right.
It's a huge problem. It really makes you think about the potential for abusing that power. like using the presidency just to benefit yourself with zero consequences.
It's a scary thought. And it makes you realize, like, transparency, accountability, those things are so crucial, especially at the highest levels.
100%. And I think that's why this case, all of these legal arguments, they're so important.
Yeah.
Because they force us to really examine those tough questions.
Yeah.
How does power actually work, especially in a democracy?
And ultimately, no one is above the law.
Exactly.
Right.
Even the president. And I think it's easy in our digital age, like we've been talking about, to kind of blur those lines between what's personal and what's professional. But when it comes to the law, those lines are still there.
They're definitely still there. Well, we've covered a lot of ground. Presidential power, gray areas of the law, how the digital age changes, well, everything, I think, when it comes to trying to understand someone's actions and what their intent was.
It makes you think, what does it even mean to be the president but also a private citizen at the same time in this day and age?
It's the question, right?
It is.
And we are left with a lot to ponder. Like, if something looks unofficial on the surface, can it still have huge consequences legally, politically? What does that say about power, responsibility, all of it in the 21st century?
I don't have the answers, unfortunately, but they're good questions.
The big questions, the best kind. And on that note, we will leave you with one final thought. In a world where information moves so fast, how do we make sure that the pursuit of justice can keep up? Keep thinking about it, and we'll be back next time with another deep dive.